adolescents where they are the caregiver for their younger siblings. In some cases, the primary caregiver, where they are getting them ready for school, they're taking them to school, they're bringing them home. It's a lot of responsibility. So there are a lot of stressors that contribute. Coming back.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but I'm echoing. I get on Zoom every day. I don't know what.
It's probably not you, but you can hear me now?
I can hear you, but okay.
Yeah, you're fine. Keep going. Keep going.
Okay. So those are some of the adverse events or situations that commonly impact adolescents and contributes to mental health issues. And then we think about developmentally, adolescents have not developed in a way, depending on their life experiences, that they can cope. So the inability to cope is a big factor in mental health and mental illness for people. So that's another risk factor. Unemployment right now is a big risk factor. Financial instability within the home is a risk factor for adolescents and them managing and dealing with mental illness. So when we think about risk factors, again, there are also protective factors. And kind of mentioned some of those earlier, but having a supportive family environment and social networks, whether that is, and that family environment doesn't have to be a normal family environment or quote unquote normal family environment. It may be I'm being raised by my sister or I'm being raised, but it's a solid, consistent, and stable family environment. It makes a big difference. I'm in a social network. I'm in the step team at school. I'm consistently engaging with this group of positive individuals. Church can play a big role here when it's addressing those things. Concrete support for basic needs. Not having your basic needs met, not only being homeless, not sure if I'm going to eat, that can be a risk factor, but it can also be a family protective factor where I know I'm getting my basic needs met. Stable peer relationships. Peer relationships for adolescents is a major factor where I have consistent, because adolescents who don't have positive, consistent peer relationships are often those who isolate, those who deal more frequently with depression because of that, and anxiety. So having those peer relationships that are positive and add to their life is a major protective factor. Parental education, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the parent has to have a master's degree or PhD, but just parental education around mental health, around stress management, around anger management. Those kind of things can really be a protective factors for addressing adolescents' needs. Again, I brought up access to healthcare and social services, which is a good factor. It may be that an adolescent doesn't want to talk to their family members or to a church member. So it's really important that they have access to appropriate services, consistent services that meet their needs. Okay, caring adults, role models, not necessarily professional supports, but some natural supports, where it may be a mentor or maybe just an older person that's a family friend that is safe and that that person feel comfortable with, makes a big difference. And also just community protective factors. What things are in the community that are beneficial to adolescents? How can they feel like, one, they're getting their needs met? The needs are being met, they're being heard, which is a big factor for adolescents. They're developing fulfilling relationships. They're being in situations where they have to adapt to change. they're able to use adaptive coping mechanisms. They're in situations where they start to realize their potential. A major issue with adolescents is a hopelessness, a sense of hopelessness. If we look at our society, we look at our communities, many of our adolescents feel hopeless. And that hopelessness can be put on by negative attitudes. Sometimes it can be generational. Sometimes it can be socially learned. If mom has always talked negative and dad has always been negative, then that can be a socially learned behavior. So those are things that we have to, as parents, we have to also put in check. So that goes back to a risk factor. Is it a generational, is it a biological thing? So if a parent is dealing with mental illness, it's very important for them to address that mental illness, because some of those behaviors, which may be associated with your mental illness, can be socially learned by your children. Meaning, and we think about our own lives, how did I see mom cope? How did I see dad cope? If I was growing up in a home with a mom who was depressed or anxious, and when life events happen, she cut off everything, then that can be socially learned. So it's really important. That's why I say to get buy-in from the families when you're dealing with adolescents, because sometimes not only will the services and the engagement in mental health treatment or supports be beneficial for the adolescent, having that family member address their issues and concerns makes a better chance for that child having more stability, that adolescent seeing change. So we often take on the things of our burdens of our parents. We often take on the behaviors of our parents. Just personally, I think about some of the things that I do in my own life. I know I do because I watched my mom do growing up. I put bleach in my dishwater because I watched my mom doing that growing up. Certain things, I don't wash my hands in the kitchen sink because I watched my mom doing that growing up. Also, when I turn it to coping, when I'm overwhelmed, I pray. I saw my mom doing that growing up. So if I'm in a home where there may be the opposite, my mom stays in bed all day. When I'm overwhelmed, I stayed in bed all day. So that happens. So that's a big factor sorry, there's a lot of motorcycles outside. So sorry, can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
This is fine.
There's a lot of adolescents who don't have positive image, haven't learned how to cope because they haven't seen people coping effectively. So learning how to cope effectively and getting their needs met in an appropriate way helps them to develop skills and navigate different environments where they don't feel overwhelmed, where they don't feel like they are pressured to fit into whatever category society, peers, or anyone else wants them to fit into, and getting to develop a positive self-identity, which helps them, as emotionally, which helps them developmentally, where they can function in a better way because I know who I am, I'm self-aware. And self-awareness for adolescents is an awesome thing. I've learned in individual therapy with adolescents that when they become self-aware, when they identify what it is, what's the trigger, why am I upset, why am I emotional, they deal with it better. So giving them their own power to have education on mental health. What am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way? What factors are contributing to this? And as they start to develop internal and external coping mechanisms, they'll begin to use them more so and be aware of their surroundings and their environment and have a little bit more self-control in certain settings. So it's really education for parents and the adolescents yourself is a really good protective factor and prevention factor for one, because if a lot of parents were educated, as parents become more educated, they can identify some of the risk factors and kind of start to address those things, whether it's them engaging with their child, them identifying a counselor or a therapist to engage with their child, a mentor to engage with their child. Just good education for the whole family nucleus, the whole family unit. Grandma needs to be educated on mental health. Some of the things that we did then, we can't do now. Some of the things that we said to children, and we may have not identified that it is impact, we can't say now. So we have to really work on educating everyone in the family unit so that we can address adolescents mental health. A big factor is some of the generational norms, some of the cultural factors play a big role, depending on whether that is a cultural factor within that adolescent's family, community, because everything's different. We can't just say just in the Black community, because there's a Black community, there's a white community, but there's also those family units who do things differently. Go back to the example about me learning, socially learning in my family culture, we put bleach in dishwater. I have a friend who's also African American who was in disbelief that we put bleach in dishwater. So even though we both are the African American culture, there's different things within each family culture in the way that people do things. So in adolescence, sometimes we forget that not only are they learning the culture of the community, the greater world, but they have their own family culture. So and a big one for the African American community, and within small nucleus communities culturally, has been, we don't talk about our emotions, we don't deal with things, we don't address things. It's okay, don't talk about it. So a lot of adolescents are walking around dealing with a lot of issues, a lot of stress, a lot of things that they aren't able to communicate, and they don't feel that they have a trusting situation to communicate those things. So when you are hopeless, alone, feel isolated, it's very likely that you're going to deal with stress and deal with things that cause anxiety, depression. And so again, a lot of things that we as a community have to start looking at is, how are we serving adolescents? How are we addressing adolescents? How are we empowering adolescents? And even beyond adolescents, even younger kids, allowing them to express their emotions, allowing them to start to identify their triggers, allowing them to talk about things. Just to shut up and be quiet and go in your room is not working now. That's not what is working. I think that is a big factor of why a lot of people in the African American community especially have been resilient with some of the things that they've been through. However, that resiliency doesn't minimize the trauma or the internal issues that have come about from their experience. So in a place now that we know more, we're getting more educated on certain things, we have to really support adolescents in a way that is open. We want them to be able to talk to us and communicate with us. And it's not to say that we won't hold them to a standard. The standard still needs to be there. However, we want to make an open conversation where they feel freely to engage about their feelings and what's going on. We need to make sure that they feel heard. That's a big factor for adolescents, often not feeling like they are heard and keeping things in. Although there are some adolescents who may need things a step further, there are some individuals with emotional disturbances, behavior disturbances that may need medication for some. And for some, that's going to be the way that they manage well and do well. But that comes again with education. I had a 12-year-old who was all F student. And so you have to deal with every aspect of the child. So this young lady had all Fs, very, very aggressive. After going to therapy, I identified that there was sexual trauma. So she started to deal with the sexual trauma. So some of the behavior went down, but the grades were still the same. So she got treated and started taking medication for ADHD. She's an all A student. She's doing well. Not to say that she's not, she still going to deal with the everyday stresses, but sometimes we have to look at the whole thing. One may say everything is connected just to the trauma, but there was also ADHD. Even though that could have impacted, the trauma can impact that, we have to address the whole person. And so in doing that, you can see a lot of changes and support. And again, that comes with consistency. Her identifying that sexual trauma may have not happened if she didn't have consistent relationship with a therapist who she was able to trust. So that is a big factor in adolescence, in dealing with adolescents and managing them. Again, I always go to education because adolescents spend most of their time in schools, right? So teachers really need to be educated on trauma. Teachers need to be educated on the chronological developmental age, psychological age, right? Is a teenager that comes in your class and you're looking at her body frame and you're expecting her to have a certain standard or behave in a certain way. And she's not, because developmentally she's not there, or you're looking at her chronological age and saying she should be this or he should be that. But then there's the developmental part. And then there's also a functional part where this person has had life experiences that they feel like they're more mature than you, right? And so here's this teacher coming in and identifying herself as an authority over me. I'm not taking that. I do everything in my house. I take care of my sisters and brothers. I do the laundry. I'm grown. So all those factors and being educated on the experience of the population that you're working with, adolescents, is really important. So from the household is a collective, taking it back to even when we say it takes a village to raise a child, that village needs to not only be within the family nucleus, but it needs to be community members, church members, teachers, everybody that has some kind of engagement or involvement with children, police officers. In some communities where the police officers have those relationships, you'll see that there's less decreased violence. There's decreased issues with teenagers because I'm able to talk to Officer Jones. I'm able to talk to Officer Johnson. But that takes for that officer also to not just see this person as somebody who's doing something negative or somebody who is, but what's the root behind the negative behavior that I'm seeing? So by everybody being educated on adolescence and mental health and trauma, adverse events, we now have people who are able to stand in the gaps, who are able to understand what's going on and how to deal with it. And not be afraid to talk about these things with each other, not being afraid to nobody knows everything. So learning something new or having these conversations like we're doing today, where we are engaging and talking about these experiences around mental health, whether it's for younger children, adolescents, adults, seniors, the more we talk about it, the more we engage about these things, the more benefit our community as a large can benefit from addressing mental health. One thing I wanted to address.
Well, can I ask a question?
Yes.
You've said so many things that are great. I wanted to kind of go back. I did not want to miss the part about the protective factors and risk factors.
Okay.
Can you, okay, the way I understand what you're saying is if we can encourage the protective factors in children or adolescents, we can decrease the impact of the negative risk factors.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So
And
if we start to okay, if we start to really engage children around some of the protective factors, supportive things, then the other things can be eliminated. So so if we think about if risk factor is unstable home, if we start to find stable housing communities for people, then there's more stability. So there's less likely that I'm going to want to hang in a negative environment when I have this environment to be in. There's it's less likely that I'm not going to feel like being heard, like that I'm not being heard when me and my mom have daily talks about my feelings. You know, it decreases those risks. The violence, I'm not experiencing violence as community violence goes down. My anxiety goes down. I'm not as anxious in the community. I'm not as anxious about certain things. So as a protective factors, community support, healthy caregivers, education, as those factors increase, then it's likely that the risk factors will decrease. And now there's more stability. Not saying that they won't ever deal with things, because there are individuals who may have really low risk factors but still deal with some of those things. And that's to be perspective. Again, back to the social learning. So environmental factors, biological factors, but as we develop other protective factors around those things, we can kind of decrease the cycle of mental health by addressing the risk factors with the protective factors.
And you mentioned, I believe, that one of the protective factors can be churches, you know, like Sunday school.
Mm-hmm. Sunday school. Yeah, some Sunday school is a big one, but in Sunday school, there has to be an arena for adolescents, right? So when we think about, when we go to many of the churches, we see what do they call it? Church daycares, and then we see adults in their class. A lot of times the adolescent age is the age group that's kind of like, I'm too old to be in there with them babies, and I'm too young in there with the adults. And is anybody really addressing what I'm going through here, right? And so I'm unheard, unseen. So we have to really be real and address these real life experiences that are happening for adolescents with the word of God, that we can still do that. So it's not like we say, I think sometimes churches don't know how, don't want to, don't feel comfortable to, and it's not all churches, just some don't feel comfortable with addressing some of these things. But we don't need to change the word of God, but we need to address what they're going to in the right now, right? So the word of God hasn't changed, that stays the same. So I can address your issues with identity with the same word of God that was there before. But if I'm not trying to address it, then it becomes an issue for you. If I'm not addressing your sexual temptation, the word of God is still applicable for that. So I think we have to remember, how can I put the word of God into these situations? I'm not going to change the word of God. I'm not going to try to be so hip or do all this, but I want to address these real life experiences that these adolescents are having in this arena. And even outside of just Bible study, just having positive role models. A lot of times now at church, we go to church, we come home. We go to church, it's not real solid relationships. We lost the fellowship in a lot of churches, where churches aren't fellowshipping like they used to do, where it was, when I say fellowship, having food after service is a good time to fellowship with adolescents and talk and engage them in a way that they can feel open and supported. Having connections to community events and things that does not take away from who God is and Him receiving the glory, but also gives room for adolescents to come in, right? So I think.
So I have a question right there. So if you have an adolescent who's getting the, can you hear me?
Let me turn my sound up.
Okay. So you have an adolescent who's getting the support, the encouragement, as you said, through the church and all of that, but the parent is not on board and doesn't seem to want to participate in that part of the child's life with the church because they're not in there.
Yeah, and that's a big thing because, like, you know, we have some churches that do outreach, and sometimes they outreach adolescents, and it's a consistent factor. What all you can really do, the number one thing you can do is pray that God opens the eyes of that parent and reveals Himself in a way that they can get closer to Him and see Him. Because if they are blind and talking, it won't change anything. Prayer and fasting is what will. However, in a way that you show that that child consistency in that relationship, even though we know that they're going home and they're experiencing whatever they experience, because you're not going to always get buy-in from parents. So if I'm supposed to be watering this child, I'm just going to continue to water. If I'm weeding, then I'm going to continue to weed. If whatever I'm set to do, I'm going to do, even though it does make it more difficult when you don't have buy-in from the parent, from the supports. If you're consistent, you know, you're planting seeds, and you just pray that those seeds come forth despite the environment, despite what's going on at home. That's all you can do. It may not be today. It may be like, wow, this child who was coming to church, coming to Bible study, but they just can't get away from their environment, their family environment. But it may be a seed that you're planting. It may not, you may just were the planter. And then next year, somebody can come and water. So just be consistent with that child as much as you can be.
Another thing that you talked about, you kept talking about the hopeless attitude. I have a couple questions, but you talk about the hopeless attitude, and I know that's a big problem when a child feels hopeless and isolated. You know, when I'm not really sure what happened, and those of you who are on the line with children can definitely let me know. I don't know if the adults have gotten really selfish, that we don't really think about children, adolescents anymore in the way that we should, because it seems like at some point adults were more involved with children, even if they didn't have kids, right? You know, you had more, you know, it just seemed like there was more involvement. Because I'm concerned, I'm, you know, worried just listening to you talk, knowing that we have a lot of children, adolescents who are dealing with hopelessness, who are dealing with isolation, but if they have parents that we can't get to or can't get through, so now we have a child who has to deal with that hopelessness and isolation kind of by themselves, especially during this time frame. And I know faith is going to be a big factor. Like you said, we have to plant, some people will water. We have to trust God that the seeds that we throw out there will catch root. But can you speak to that hopelessness? If you see a child who's hopeless, or you see a child who you're concerned about, and you're not the parent, or they don't have a parent who's supportive, is there, you know, what can we do? What can we say?
Well, I've seen that a lot of times, adolescents specifically, just want you to be real with them. They want you to be real with them, and they want you to, one of the things that we're commanded to do is show love. Love and care. Like I said, is a stage where they're mistrust, trust, they're trying to, self-identity is going on. There's a lot happening. Peer relationships are very important. So sometimes we don't have to go in there demanding change. We don't have to go in there being negative about certain things. You be consistent. So just like there's social learning that takes place in the home with parents, there's social learning that happens with supports, right? So if I notice, wow, no matter what, all this time I've been talking to Miss Arnetta at church, or when I see her, she's always been consistent, right? Who she showed me is who she always is. Her caring about me didn't stop. They want unconditional love, a lot of them. And so they haven't experienced that. When I was good in school with my mentor, until she saw that I got in a fight, or until my behaviors got to a place where she couldn't take it. Some, especially some younger females deal with, so for instance, when they have PMS, then some of them may have early onset of bipolar disorder. And sometimes the supports that are in their life, when they start to experience some of those behaviors that are associated with impulsiveness, some of those things that are associated with those diagnoses, they change or they back away from it. You're not my child. I don't really got to deal with that, right? And so the unconditional love. And so it's like, oh, just what I thought you were going to leave to. You wasn't going to support me consistently. And like I said, of course, we want to respect parents when people do have parents, but if we are allowed to have relationships in church or wherever other arena we have, just let that relationship be consistent, right? God helps us with our hopelessness because we trust in him, because he's a never changing God. He's an unconditional loving God, right? And so we have to do that same thing to combat hopelessness. I'm hopeless because these have been my experience and this is all I have seen. But now here's something different from what I've seen that's been consistent. And like I said, it may not always take on the first round. It may not take in that whole situation, but it may be a time where that child remembers something that you said. So we combat the hopelessness with unconditional love. We can combat the hopelessness with consistency and love.
And that's so good, because I think too that we can't let the age factor get in the way. I know I worked at a group home for boys one time, and the thought process was that you have to try to talk young, have to be young.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the case. I just went in and I was my same old self,
Mm-hmm.
and the kids, right? But the children, the young people, they responded, right? Mm-hmm. So I think too, we cannot be afraid to reach out to adolescents or to younger people, because the media or people will tell us that, that we don't have anything in common with them, because the fact of the matter is that there's no temptation that's different. Everything that we're dealing with, we have dealt with. It's just that the situation is different. There's more of it. There's more media, more TV.
Yeah, more visibility of it, yeah.
Right, but it's the same thing. So we do have something to offer, because I think if those of us who have faith don't reach out to adolescents, young people, it does make it harder. It does make their journey even harder, or it takes longer for them to get to where they need to be, because there's no support. There's no one. We have to be that model. We have to be that person that's standing in the gap, if you will. People like to think that, just because a person was homeless, that went to jail or had a terrible life, that person is going to be a terrible adult. And that's not the case. When you look at those adults who prospered, you realize that it may have only been one caring person in their life. That one caring person was that made the difference. So I think that's so important.
Yeah, and you're right about that. And then I had I thank the Lord that I had a mom who was consistent. I had a mom who instilled faith in us. But growing up, everybody in my environment didn't have that. And growing up in Southeast DC, and sometimes it was really difficult dealing with some rough things that were going on in the area. And some of my friends didn't have that. Well, we had this one teacher in kindergarten, and it was something so simple that she did, but everybody always talk about it. And to this day, they still talk about Miss Steinberg. And the only thing that Miss Steinberg did was every morning we never ate breakfast in the cafeteria. We ate breakfast at the table like we were a family, and she made waffles with syrup and different fruit. And she cooked, they had the kitchen back in the classroom back then. So just that consistency, just that fact of her being who she was. And kids still these days, I talk to some guys and I'm like, I'm 32 years old and we all still remember Miss Steinberg. Mm-hmm. So just being having that genuine love and care, difference. Will it work for everybody? There's always going to be exceptions to the rules. No, I don't think we should be deterred from doing it. And also with adults, even though things are not new and things are the same and we've been through stuff, we have to not be a know-it-all.
Well, one thing that I have encountered with dealing with adults that have some teenagers, they seem to forget we do as adults that at one point we were teenagers and we didn't do everything right, and now we want to all of a sudden we want to be dogmatic and jumping all over their cases and realize that we made mistakes and we had to work through them. So are we willing to work through these mistakes with them? That's one of the things that I have learned in, what happened with all of this is that, we just, and it's okay to share some of our experiences with them.
Yeah.
I don't mean telling your whole life history, but
I
might be going through something and it's like, well, I can relate, I've been there, and the points that we share that can let them see, wait a minute, this has happened before and I can get through this better than what I think I can, and so that if we can come at them in that respect instead of always, well, you need to do what's right, you never, no, you can't come in that way. We got to be honest with them.
Yes.
And this is where we as adults sometimes miss it because and especially if it's a parent, they want to make sure that they come across as the good parent. I got it all together. Well, as parents, let's be honest, we don't always have it all together. And we may not respond like we need to for their benefit and have to go back and apologize to them. So let's not forget that when it comes to dealing with these teenagers.
Yeah.
Are you still there, Anika?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you see me?
Okay. I'm playing around with it, so
Oh.
Okay, there you go. And another thing that you said too, and this is really not just for adolescents, but for adults. You said resiliency does not minimize the trauma. And I think that's so critical because especially us as African Americans, we've gone through a lot. And despite the things that we've gone through, we've still been able to thrive, right? We've still been able to become lawyers, to become doctors, to become clinicians, hairdressers. In spite of the abuse that we've gone through the system, police brutality, poor mental health treatment, we're still been able to have, the advances that we have. And sometimes when we see those things, that's resiliency. We don't understand that resiliency cannot cover up the trauma that we've gone through. Can you speak a little more about that?
Yes. Kind of just what you said, a lot of times that happens and we say, wow, she's so strong. And we don't realize, for instance, in school, we see students adolescents who have, she's so good in school despite everything that's going on. She's homeless, she's been in foster care, this has happened, but she got all A's and now she's off to Georgetown. But did anybody ever check on how she was really coping with things or how she was, dealing with things? Yes, she's resilient, but that doesn't minimize the trauma that she's experienced. That doesn't minimize the after effects, the long-term effects that can be impact that a person can have from experiencing traumas. And we don't realize sometimes all the impacts that trauma has on us. I know recently, just myself, and I can, be transparent, when I was younger, I had a friend kidnapped at gunpoint when we were walking from school. I never forget the day to this day. And although I was really resilient, and I think about it, it never was addressed really. I never talked about it, never talked to anybody about it. It was kind of like, oh, it happened and it wasn't addressed. And too recently I started saying, wow, I didn't notice how hypervigilant I was out in the community with, everybody's always, Nikki, you observe everything. And I'm always observing my surroundings. So that's just to say, yeah, I went on to go to college and do the things that I needed to do to be successful in life. However, there still was an impact from that trauma experience that I had that never went addressed. And so you can look at the things that have been accomplished, the resiliency behind some of the things, but there's still that core thing of trauma or an experience that we have that we still have to address and acknowledge. And I think acknowledging is a big thing. And I think too often for adolescents, especially adolescents, one thing that we don't realize, a lot of adolescents now have parents who are not that much older than them, right? So often they have shared experiences, and it's not like it's because this is a social norm to me. That's not a big deal. I was too, right? So if mom is saying that because mom is only 12 years older than me or 13 years older than me, and she doesn't identify this as trauma, it hasn't been addressed for her, and now it's not being addressed for me. So we can't let resiliency be a cover that doesn't allow healing to happen from trauma. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?